The room had not changed in 40 years, but the air felt thinner now, as if time had been holding its breath. Dust floated in narrow bands of light cutting through warped blinds, drifting like pale remnants of an evening that never ended. The outlines of old tape markers, faint, cracked, still clung stubbornly to the wooden floor. And at the center, where a young woman once lay, the board seemed permanently darkened, as though the memory had seeped inward and refused to leave. For a moment, investigator Samuel Crane stood motionless, letting the quiet settle around him. Silence in old crime scenes rarely felt natural. It felt curated, selective, guarding something. The room at 42 Ashford Lane had become a museum of halted time, its corners stiff with secrets, its walls carrying a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Crane inhaled slowly. Dust, faint varnish, and the old, lingering trace of cold winter air. Beneath it all, something subtler, an echo of the night that had never been answered. Her name was Aurelia Maren, 24, a university researcher with a reputation for precision and a shy habit of carrying 3 notebooks everywhere she went. She lived alone. She read obsessively. She had friends, few but loyal. And on February 17, 1979, Washington's coldest night that month, someone ended her life in this room with no signs of struggle, no clear motive, and no surviving witness. Crane had not been the lead back then. He had been younger, quieter, still learning how silence could shape a case more than noise ever could. The veteran detectives combed the room, pulled fingerprints, interviewed neighbors, traced her week, her friends, her movement. And yet the file closed the way too many files did during that era, lacking shape, lacking direction, collapsing under the weight of missing clarity. Now, decades later, Crane re-entered the room with careful steps, treating every scuff, every particle of dust, as though it held a voice only patience could hear. He let his gloved fingers graze the windowsill where Aurelia had last been seen alive. The faintest scratch marked the paint, an insignificant line at first glance, but he paused. Even small, near-invisible things in an old case could become signposts. He whispered to himself, not out of habit but out of an old, persistent guilt. Should have looked closer. Fragments of words barely formed. He moved to the center of the room. A faint reflection cast across a broken shard of mirror lying beneath an overturned dresser. It had been catalogued decades ago. Nothing about it had seemed meaningful then. Now it glimmered with a strange, reluctant presence, as though it wanted to surface a truth that had been ignored. Crane crouched, listening to the creak of the old house, to the memory of the investigation he once watched from the margins. Aurelia's expression in the case photos still weighed on him. Not fear, not panic, more like interruption. As if something familiar had surprised her, paused her breathing, and then stopped her altogether. He looked around one more time. The room gave nothing freely. It never had. This was where the story started again. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. It began with a box that should not have existed, a mislabeled container found during a courthouse archival transfer in the fall of 2024. Crane had been notified out of professional courtesy, the clerk assuming it simply contained redundant paperwork from decades-old cases. But when he opened it, the scent of aged paper and mildew carried the memory of something different. The evidence tag reading A. Maren, Ashford Lane. He froze. The Aurelia case had been declared thoroughly processed. All physical items were supposedly logged, stored, or destroyed based on protocol. But this box contained something that had never appeared in the official inventory. A small envelope sealed with brittle tape, marked only with the initials AM and a faded February date. Inside lay a photograph. Aurelia standing near a waterfront railing, looking past the camera toward something indistinct. Her posture was uneasy, one shoulder slightly raised. The wind pressed her coat against her frame. What struck Crane, though, was not Aurelia. It was the presence of a blurred figure in the deep background, partially concealed behind a lamppost. Only one side of the face was visible, but the angle suggested intent, observation, stillness within movement. The timestamp placed the photo 2 nights before Aurelia died. Crane stared at it for nearly a full minute, the edges of the paper digging faintly into his gloves. It was the kind of detail that could alter the architecture of a case. Someone watching her. Someone the original investigators missed entirely. He placed the photo under a magnifier. The lamppost behind the figure had not been part of the waterfront design in 1979. It had been a temporary installation for a construction project. That meant the location could be narrowed down to a specific block. The city records confirmed it within hours. Crane's breath steadied. This was the first real shift the case had seen since the Carter administration. Word traveled quickly to his division, and by the end of the week the cold case board was pulled from storage. Aurelia's name returned to the whiteboard in crisp black marker, an abrupt revival after decades of stillness. Crane felt the weight of it. The sudden presence of her name again, stark and unsoftened by time, sparked something old in him. A quiet responsibility, a lingering failure. He returned to the room at Ashford Lane almost immediately, the photo tucked inside a protective sleeve. He set it upon the same dresser where the original evidence team had once spread their notes. The house creaked softly, as though aware of the intrusion. This time, he did not walk the room as a visitor. He walked it like someone asking for forgiveness. A small, nearly forgotten detail caught his eye again, the scratch on the windowsill he had noticed earlier. He leaned in closer. Under the dust, the line formed a subtle arc. Not a random scrape, but the curve of something metallic dragged in haste. Something like the edge of a bracelet, a wristwatch, or perhaps a key ring. He took a step back and looked at the room differently now, letting the logic reconstruct itself piece by piece. Aurelia was meticulous. Friends described her as someone who avoided clutter, someone who placed objects deliberately. A scratch near the window implied movement, perhaps conflict but brief, or an unexpected interaction. The reopened case changed everything. The photograph suggested surveillance. The scratch suggested interaction. Together they created a faint but emerging outline, and for the first time in decades, Crane felt the case breathe. Investigator examines past reports to identify overlooked details. The old reports lay across Crane's desk in uneven stacks, smelling faintly of damp cardboard and forgotten ink. These were not digital files. These were the physical notes of tired detectives, their handwriting sharp in some places, drifting in others, shaped by long nights and winter fatigue. Crane moved systematically, methodically, letting his eyes adjust to the smaller print of the late 70s report style, tight margins, abbreviated phrasing, sparse emotional descriptions. He found Aurelia's daily habits documented by neighbors, early walks, late-night reading, quiet living. No signs of conflict, no reported threats, no romantic disputes. Her world seemed insulated but not secretive. He turned a page and found a detail that felt oddly out of place. A neighbor reported hearing a soft metallic click near Aurelia's door on the night before she died. It had been dismissed then, chalked up to settling pipes or the building's faulty radiator. Crane underlined it. The building's inspection records showed no mechanical issues that would produce such a sound. Next, he read the statements from Aurelia's colleagues. One noted she had been distracted the week before her death. Not distressed, just more inward, more careful with her notebooks. She had switched bags, opting for one with a metal clasp instead of her usual fabric satchel. Crane paused. Metal clasp. Window scratch. Metallic sound. He marked each connection with a small red tab. Then, deeper in the files, he found a page that had been mistakenly clipped behind an unrelated section, a list of incoming calls Aurelia had received at her workplace. One stood out, an unreturned call from an unidentified number 2 days before the incident. The number had no match in the 1979 phone directory. He allowed the weight of that to settle. He listened to the room, the hum of the heater, the soft rustle of shifting paper. His own heartbeat seemed louder against the quiet. Guilt pressed steady in his chest, not consuming but familiar. He should have found these patterns earlier, years earlier. But guilt was not evidence. Guilt didn't alter timelines. Something else did. He returned to the photograph. Beneath magnification, he noticed something on Aurelia's left wrist, a bracelet with a small, circular charm. The charm was metallic, thin, capable of leaving a curved scratch if struck against a surface. Except Aurelia was not near a window in the photograph, and the scratch in her apartment had been higher than her natural height when standing relaxed. Meaning, she wasn't the one who caused it. Someone taller. Someone reaching. Someone close enough to leave a mark in haste. The photograph had revealed a watcher. The overlooked reports suggested interaction. The scratch whispered a brief encounter. Piece by piece, a shape emerged, not yet a solution but a trajectory. Crane exhaled slowly. The case was no longer silent. The board filled slowly, the markers adding names with deliberate strokes, each line drawn with the restraint of someone who understood how easily assumptions could distort the truth. Crane did not rush the process. Every suspect had to earn space on the board through logic, not intuition. 3 names surfaced first. 1. Daniel Havers. Aurelia's colleague in the research department, bright, driven, known for his intensity. The old reports described him as professionally competitive, personally distant. He had been working on a similar study, and an anonymous statement from that time hinted that he may have felt overshadowed by Aurelia's progress. His alibi placed him at a departmental dinner the night of the incident, but no one had noted his arrival time with certainty. Crane circled his name. 2. Miriam Valk. A neighbor in the same building. She reported hearing the metallic sound near the door, but her statement had always carried an odd shade of hesitation, as if she were omitting something. Valk had a history of disputes with other tenants, minor things but enough to note. She lived alone, kept odd hours, and claimed she barely knew Aurelia, though building logs showed their mailboxes were adjacent. Alibi: at work during the time of death. Verified, but only by a coworker who had since passed away. 3. Jonah Redden. A local contractor with a brief presence in Aurelia's life. Records showed he had performed maintenance on the building's foundation the month before the incident. His signature appeared on the work orders. A neighbor's testimony suggested he'd spoken to Aurelia more than once, though he denied remembering her. He had no alibi for the night of the death, simply stating he must have been home. Crane wrote each name cleanly, stepping back to examine them under the washed-out office lights. Each suspect felt incomplete, their motives thin, their alibis either loose or unverifiable, but none sharp enough to draw blood from the narrative. He opened the drawer containing the old interview notes. Paper brushed against his gloves with the softness of dry leaves. The cold case team in 1979 had interviewed dozens of individuals. Most had slipped into obscurity across the decades, but a few statements returned with new weight under current scrutiny. Daniel Havers had reportedly visited Aurelia's lab station 2 days before her death, commenting on her recent secrecy. A neutral observation then, a point of interest now. Miriam Volk had once approached the landlord about Aurelia's late-night lights disturbing the hallway. Not a conflict, but enough to suggest awareness, attention paid at unusual hours. Jonah Redden had been seen near the waterfront project where the photograph was taken, not by name but by tall man in a contractor's coat. Crane compared that with the blurred figure behind the lamppost. The height matched, the build matched, but blurry silhouettes were fragile evidence. He sat down slowly. The chair whispered against the floor. 3 suspects, 3 motives that did not quite align, 3 alibis that drifted in and out of reliability. And behind all of them, the faint, almost intangible presence of someone else, someone not yet on the board, someone who had followed Aurelia to the water. Crane lowered his head, listening to the room as though it might offer a clue. He allowed the quiet to thicken. A case like this required patience, a kind of stillness that could filter noise from truth. He marked each suspect with a thin red underline. No conclusions yet, only structure, only slow assembly of something that had remained in fragments for too long. Clues emerged slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. Crane began with the metallic sound again. He replayed the neighbor's testimony in his mind, the soft click, the uncertainty in her voice. It stood out because it did not fit the rhythm of the building at the time. The other tenants described the pipes, the creaks, the radiator coughs. None mentioned clicks. He returned to the window, to the scratch curving slightly upward. The height suggested someone reaching over Aurelia, someone taller, someone attempting to prevent movement, not violently, not chaotically, but urgently. A visit then, not an attack, a conversation that broke its intended path. He took out Aurelia's work journal, retrieved from storage years ago. Her handwriting was tight and even, but one entry from the week of her death interrupted the pattern. The writing leaned slightly left, the letters narrower, as though written under mild strain. Need to revisit waterfront notes. Something doesn't match. Crane let his eyes linger on that sentence. The waterfront again, the photograph, the blurred watcher. He flipped to the next page. The entry was short, a single line. "Will speak to him if needed." No name, no context, but the pronoun placed someone in her life, someone she had considered approaching. Crane's breath slowed. Who was him? He scanned through the suspects. Havers. He and Aurelia had spoken often, but coworkers said she rarely struggled to address him, no hesitation. Redden, she barely knew him. Volk, not a him. Someone else. The case widened gently, almost reluctantly, like a curtain pushed by a cold draft. A new possibility drifted in, not yet a suspect, but a gravitational center pulling the details inward. Crane reached for the photograph again. Under enhanced magnification, he noticed something small near Aurelia's hand, a corner of paper protruding from her coat pocket. It hadn't been analyzed originally. The focus had been on her face, her posture. But now Crane recognized the shape, the same paper stock used in her research department for internal memos. Why take work papers to the waterfront at night? Why look uneasy while standing there? Why have a watcher behind her? He returned to the journals, searching for anything linked to her research. The thinness of some entries suggested she had been cautious, perhaps not wanting to commit certain thoughts to writing. Crane's pulse stayed steady, but the weight of the realization began forming. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't conflict with neighbors. It wasn't a contractor's fleeting acquaintance. It was work. It was discovery. It was something someone else didn't want exposed. Emotion remained absent in the documentation, but Crane felt it rising beneath the surface of the case, a muted, pressured tension. Aurelia had been approaching a truth. Someone else had approached her first. Piece by piece, the inconsistencies aligned. The metallic sound wasn't accidental. It was the window latch moving. The scratch wasn't random. It marked a moment of hesitation or restraint. The distracted behavior at work wasn't emotional drift. It was caution. The waterfront photo wasn't casual. It was surveillance. Crane leaned back, letting the fluorescent lights wash over the board. Every inconsistency whispered a quiet emotional friction between Aurelia and someone who wanted something from her, someone whose presence never made the original suspect list. The room's silence deepened. A detail Crane had almost overlooked resurfaced from the earlier notes. A colleague mentioning Aurelia had recently disagreed with someone outside the department about access to research data. He wrote the phrase on the board. Someone outside. He stared at the letters until the implication settled. The emotional conflict was not rooted in personal relationships. It was born from professional territory, information, access, control. Something worth watching her for, something worth visiting her for, something worth preventing her from revealing. And then something worth killing her for. Unexpected twist reveals the least suspected person as killer. The twist came not through drama, but through a soft, almost reluctant detail, buried in a memo from the university's maintenance department dated a week before Aurelia's death. A name, Thomas Levin. Position, building technician. Primary duty, managing access to restricted floors and lab equipment. Crane frowned. Levin had never appeared in the case file, never interviewed, never listed, never mentioned beyond this single overlooked maintenance log, a ghost in the bureaucratic machinery. He pulled additional records. Levin had been on shift the night Aurelia stayed late at the lab 2 nights before the waterfront photograph. He was responsible for unlocking the side entrance used by staff working after hours. Crane dug deeper. A statement from Aurelia's colleague noted she had once complained about a technician lingering too long near her workstation. The colleague couldn't remember the name, but the timing matched Levin's scheduled rounds. Crane's heartbeat ticked unevenly. He rose from his chair, paced once, letting the logic cement itself. Levin had access. Levin had freedom of movement. Levin had been overlooked. He returned to the photograph and examined the blurred watcher's build. The fit was closer to Levin than any of the original suspects. Then came the detail that sealed the trajectory, the metallic detail that tied the room, the scratch, and the sound together. In Levin's archived personnel file, Crane found something that made the air in the office thin. Levin wore a large steel key ring clipped to his belt during all shifts. Not small, not subtle. Heavy, ring-shaped, the exact curvature capable of leaving the arc-like scratch on Aurelia's window. Crane did not move. The realization washed over him in slow, clinical increments. Levin had keys to every door on campus. Levin had proximity. Levin had opportunity. But motive. Crane searched the records again. A disciplinary note surfaced. Levin had once been reprimanded for attempting to access the research archives without proper clearance. The memo described it as miscommunication, but the tone suggested concern. Aurelia's notes. Her research. Her hesitation. Her plan to speak to him if needed. It all turned inward, closing around the simplest, quietest figure. The one never questioned, never suspected. The least visible person in the case had been the one standing nearest the door all along. Crane closed the file quietly. The scrape of the folder felt final. The twist was not dramatic. It was methodical, inevitable, the kind of truth that stayed in the shadows because no one bothered to turn toward it. And now it had surfaced. The arrest unfolded with the same flat efficiency that closes long-simmering administrative loops. An early morning warrant, a quiet knock, a man led from a modest home into a pale van. The procedural machinery moved without flourish, paper signed, cuff placed, fingerprints taken, each motion a small, deliberate closure of tasks that had been left open for decades. For many in the division, this was the neat end they had wanted, a line drawn where the file could finally be archived and the whiteboard cleared. For Crane, it felt different. The motions were precise, but the feeling beneath them was softer and more complicated than triumph. He watched Levin, hands folded, shoulders neither rigid nor particularly humbled, walk past the courthouse steps. There was no confession shouted, no sudden unraveling. The man's face remained a study in ordinary expression, the kind people carry when their life has been measured in tools and schedules and quiet routine. To the cameras, to the paperwork, to the law, the case had found its final actor. To experience it like that, so clean, so official, was to feel the justice system perform its assigned role. Identification, accountability, the slow but certain movement of consequence. Crane followed the procession of formalities as if moving through a ritual. He signed, he certified, he noted the time down to the minute. Each recorded entry felt accurate and necessary. Records would show cause and sequence. Records would make tidy the chronology that had once been scattered across memory and mildew. The city would receive a resolution. Families and colleagues would receive statements that made events legible. In those documents, the unknown would take a name. The event that had haunted the margins would be framed in the language of closure. Yet inside the hum of fluorescent corridors and the soft clack of keyboard keys, something else lingered, an afterimage that paperwork could not capture. It was the small, private detail that had first redirected the case. The curve of metal against paint, the soft click noted by a neighbor, the single line in her journal. Those were not the kind of things that headlines repeated. They did not translate neatly into a charge or a statute. They were tiny consequences of proximity and choice, and they carried with them the most human of weights. The burden of what might have been prevented, the quiet ache of obligations deferred. Crane thought of Aurelia, her routine walks, the notebook she carried, the way she secured her papers. He thought of the photograph of her by the water, the uneasy posture, the watcher in the background who had once been invisible to investigators who had not learned to look for the small things. He thought of her line, "We'll speak to him if needed," a fragment that had shifted the case's axis. That fragment had been a plan, it had been a hesitation, it had been proactive in its simplicity. It was the sort of human attempt at self-protection that rarely reads as heroic in reports, but whose quiet bravery mattered more than any headline. The legal apparatus had performed its role, but Crane could not help returning to the personal dimensions around the edges. The colleagues who had been certain Aurelia was merely distracted, the neighbor who had heard a click and later carried the memory like a loose thread, the maintenance log that listed a name in a manner so casual it had been missed. These were the small human notes that, when combined, produced a shape that the law could now hold. They were also the reminders that truth can be hidden in administrative mundanities, the kind of details people glance past in the daily rush. He found himself walking through the now emptied rooms again, slower this time, cataloging absence the way one catalogs furniture. The house seemed smaller now, or perhaps he moved differently through it because time had added a layer of attentiveness. The old scratch on the windowsill still sat like a punctuation mark, small, inert, ordinary. It had taken years for someone to see its implication clearly. Small parts, when assembled patiently, create a whole that none of them promised alone. There was a procedural satisfaction in the arrest. There was, too, a residual unease that came from knowing justice's visible mechanics rarely touch the full interior lives caught in a case. The formal outcome, an arrest, charges, perhaps a trial, was a public thing. The private consequences were more diffuse. A colleague's regret, a neighbor's retold memory, a research department's adjusted routine. Families received a name, but not always the fullness of the why. The system provides accountability. It does not always soothe the human fissures that open long before any files are written. Crane allowed himself a moment to acknowledge how often truth disguises itself in the ordinary. Levin had been in records simply a technician, a maintainer of doors and lights and schedules. His access was an administrative fact. His presence was a line in a log. That ordinariness is precisely how some truths pass unnoticed. Bureaucracy, in its steadiness, can be a veil as much as a framework. It stores the small movements of daily life, the keys clipped to a belt, the rounds walked at night, and in those motions a pattern may form. It takes time and attention to read it. There was also the moral weight of what might have been done differently. Crane did not moralize. He did not need to. Instead, he cataloged. Older investigators had done their work with the tools and perspectives available to them. Colleagues had given truthful statements according to what they remembered. Neighbors had reported what they noticed in lived time. That accumulation of honest, limited view, no one's grievance alone, but the sum of many modest omissions, had, for years, kept a truth folded inside routine. That reality was not a failure in any single person so much as a failure of collective attention to small, meaningful anomalies. The human element of investigative work, Crane reflected, involves accepting that resolution in a file is never the same as healing in a life. The justice system closes cases. Communities and memories carry the continuity of loss. The file would now rest under a docket number, complete and searchable. People would say the case was solved. Yet for those who had loved Aurelia or shared workdays with her, the feeling would be a complicated mix of relief and old, unhealed ache. Closure in public terms did not erase the texture of missed opportunities or the years of questions. At the precinct, colleagues offered brief, careful congratulations. There were polite nods, measured words about perseverance, about persistence paying off. Crane accepted them with a kind of professional reserve. He felt gratitude for the team that had persisted, for the new eyes that re-examined a photograph and a maintenance sheet and a line in a notebook. He also felt, beneath the reserve, a quiet sorrow not easily spoken aloud. Sorrow for the small, human decisions and hesitations that had conspired to keep a truth out of sight. Before leaving, Crane took Aurelia's journals and the photograph, not as trophies but as artifacts of a life and a process. In his office, he placed them into archival sleeves where they could be preserved. He added a typed note to the file, meticulous, factual, unemotional, outlining the sequence that had led to identification. Those notes were necessary. They would serve future investigators and the archival record. Yet as he turned the page, he paused over an empty line between entries and listened to the silence there. The unresolved part of the case was not legal. The law would now have a plaintiff and a defendant, an argument, a hearing. That was the public shape of accountability. The unresolved part was moral and temporal, the time lost, the conversations that might have been had, the small acts speaking up sooner, checking a log, asking a neighbor a second question, that might have redirected events in ways we'll never see. Those were private, human regrets that no docket can remediate. Crane left the precinct that evening carrying a thin, cool weight, the knowledge that truth had been found and named, and the knowledge that numbing does not equal consolation. He walked through the city as dusk softened the buildings into plans and shadows. The waterfront where Aurelia had been photographed shimmered in the distance, ordinary and unchanged. People walked, lights blinked, and somewhere a neighbor might look up and remember a click. Those small recollections now mattered differently. They had become pieces in a public story. He did not expect catharsis. He did not expect certainty. He expected only this: that work could be done with care, that small details could be treated as precious evidence rather than as background noise, and that persistence could eventually realign where the truth sat. He also knew that these adjustments come late and imperfectly. The moral of the case to him was not a tidy lesson but a sober one. Attentiveness matters. Ordinary details can hide extraordinary consequence. Systems can reveal truth only insofar as people commit to seeing what small items mean when assembled patiently. In the last light, Crane found himself standing by the same waterfront railing from the photograph. The air tasted faintly saline. A gull called somewhere distant. He looked down at the water, its surface steady and indifferent. Justice had moved along its channels, formal, accountable, necessary. Human understanding would continue to unfold more slowly, shaped by memory and quiet reckoning. He folded his hands in front of him, feeling the weight of the years and the small ache of a life that had been interrupted. He did not expect absolution, nor did he demand it. The case would proceed now through the lanes of law and adjudication. The human residue, however, would remain: questions, regrets, intimations of how thinly truth sometimes sits upon routine. Crane turned away and walked back toward the city, leaving the water's steady surface behind. He carried with him the conviction that truth is often an accumulation of almost invisible things. That conviction was not triumphant. It was simply the clear, careful acceptance that to see is to bear witness, and bearing witness is work that continues long after official lines are drawn.